Hello, and welcome to Story Structure Lessons from the Discworld. This is Part 1, Goals for Structure. I am Zeev Witties. I am, among other things, assistant editor at Diabolical Plots magazine. I read story submissions for Podcastle magazine, and if I have any time left over after that, I also do a bunch of better reading. All of which is to say, I read a bunch of short stories and novels from every level of experience and polish and position in the entire process. And it's coming from that point of view that I want to talk about story structure. Because story structure is an area where I see a lot of authors struggling. And at the same time, it's an area that can be really difficult to discuss. We often lack basic terminology. What is story structure? What's easiest to talk about is to say what story structure is meant to accomplish, and that's where we borrow very, very naturally from the idea of physical construction. We want our stories to have strong, solid foundations. We want form to match function. We want the shape of the story to fit what we want the story to do. Very often we want a sense of symmetry or balance, and when we don't want those things, that's a structural choice too. But how helpful are all those metaphors when it comes to the practicality of how those things are actually done? Where are our blueprints? Who are our architects? What are the laws of physics that our story structures are bound by? Shouldn't we have one of these for us? What you will find pretty often is pieces that introduce one structure, like the three-act structure, which has tension and conflict that rise up to a point of climax. Or you have the hero's journey, where any story can be kind of framed as a protagonist setting out onto a quest into the unknown. These pieces tell you less about why these structures are good. Just given that they are good, that they do work well, you can make your stories conform to them. Okay, that's fine. But that doesn't really tell us what makes a structure good. That leaves us replicating the same structures again and again and again, and we don't want to limit ourselves to that. Like with physical structures, we want variety. Sometimes we want a structure that looks like this, or like this, or like this. Maybe we want to build a houseboat, or an igloo, or a roller coaster. Maybe what we want to construct is 4 elephants on the back of a turtle floating through space. Fiction is limitless. And to explore that expanse, we need to be able to talk meaningfully about all sorts of shapes and structures, to see the differences between them, and in each one of them, what is working and what isn't. Our example and guiding light through these videos is going to be Terry Pratchett's Discworld series. And I'll give a couple words about why. This is the first Discworld book, The Color of Magic, and it is about Rincewind, who is the worst wizard in the world. All the book is it's a fantasy pastiche where Rincewind keeps getting dragged along on these misadventures and running away from them all the time because he knows he's about to get killed. That's Rincewind's story. But it's not what the Discworld series is about, because the Discworld series is divided into a bunch of sub-series. Rincewind gets more books, and his stories continue to be about him being dragged along and running away from things that are likely to kill him. But at the same time, you also have the City Guard books, which is about a city watch who want things to be fair and to protect people, and they care more about their city than Rincewind has cared about anything in his entire life. Terry Pratchett invented 2 other wonderful series, the Witches books and the Death books, which bring out these wonderful ideas of how stories work and how people want stories to be true, and the idea of death as a character who has things that he wants and things that happen to them. Terry Pratchett created a whole series, continuing series out of these, and these weren't enough for him. The Discworld series also has a bunch of standalone books, which don't fit into any of the other series. They just stand entirely on their own and tell their own story. After he'd written more than 25 books, Terry Pratchett started another sub-series about technology being introduced into the Discworld, and another sub-series which is aimed at YA readers, and that one is about a young girl who is learning about magic and about the world around her. These sub-series aren't just about different characters and different events. As we'll see, they've got different structures. They are each built differently. So Discworld is a single series, but it tells many shapes of stories, which makes it a perfect example to learn structure from. This series of videos is going to be built kind of like a spiral. We're going to keep returning to the same points and the same ideas, but each time we're going to have learned more, we're going to have built some stuff up, and we're going to understand them better. And so we're going to build higher and higher as we go. We're going to start with goals for structure. What do we even want structure to accomplish? Then we're going to talk about mice, which gives us this idea of prototypes of structure, these building blocks that you can use to talk about structure, to talk about components of structure. Once we've learned those names, those building blocks, we'll use them. We'll use this idea of mice in order to look at stories and diagnose them, see where they are working well and where they're working poorly. Finally, the last video will be about taking mice with you. It'll be about how you can practically use this approach, these ideas, these categories in your own writing or in your reading to understand stories better and to be able to appreciate a wider variety of stories. A couple of important notes. The first one is spoilers. There are going to be as few of those as possible. You do not need to be familiar with the Discworld series in order to understand these videos. I'm going to be going through them as we go. I'm also going to be giving lots of examples from popular media, things you may or may not have seen. I will note there are very, very oblique references to the ending of Lord of the Rings in this video and Game of Thrones in a later video, again, not going into any detail whatsoever. Second, and more important, there are no rules. These may be videos about storycraft, but I guarantee you every single thing that I say has 1,000,001 exceptions. I'm offering you an approach and an intuition which has served me well, which makes sense to me. But if it doesn't connect for you or if you don't find it helpful, that is 100% fine. So, we're going to go over some basic goals, just the most fundamental things of what we expect a story to look like, how we expect a story to be built. These are so basic that they're going to seem trivial, but I want to get them in front of us so that we have them at the forefront of our mind. So, goal number 1, the reader should care about something in a story. And generally speaking, they should care about it as quickly as possible. When the story starts, we want them to care about something. Fair enough. Goal number 2, when whatever the reader cares about the most is resolved, is finished, then the story is over. That's the point where it's done. Goal number 3, whatever the reader cares about the most, usually they care about that thing from the beginning. In other words, there is one most important thing, one overarching thing that the reader cares about. That doesn't mean that there can't be twists and revelations, of course, things that we find out in the middle, but those will usually change the reader's understanding of the story or their expectations of the story. They won't change what they care about. And when something has been established as the most important thing, it's really hard to abandon that or demote it without the story feeling like it's lost its way. Last, the more time that a story spends on something, the more that the reader is meant to care about it. If the reader doesn't care about something, then obviously they won't want to spend a lot of time on it. And if a reader does care about something, then spending time on that thing is literally the reason that they're reading. So just to sum those up really, really quick, Beginning, something is important fast. The ending is whenever the important thing is resolved. Coherence is the most important thing, is important from start to finish. And lastly, weight is that however much screen time something that we care about is, something is important, that goes together with how important it actually is to the story. So from these very basic goals, let's imagine a one-dimensional story. A story where there's only one important thing. There's only one thing in the story that we care about. So what would that look like? It would start with introducing the thing that we care about. It would end with the thing that we care about being resolved or coming to some kind of conclusion. And the body of the story would be engaging with that one thing that we care about. It would be showing that thing or developing that thing, wrestling, whatever it is, it would be doing that one thing that we care about it. I'm going to call this a story arc. And again, this seems very, very basic, to the point of being trivial. Obviously, a story has something that we care about and we engage with it and it resolves. That's fine. But I want it in front of us, and particularly I want to contrast it with another very natural, very typical view of what a story arc might be. Here's something that people tend to think very naturally. A story arc starts with a compelling opening situation. Something happens that makes the situation interesting. And then the situation develops. It has twists, it has turns, things happen, the conflicts, then the tensions come out. And then finally, there is an ending in which all the open threads are resolved. And this is also another view of what you might call a story arc. And this idea of a story arc makes a lot of sense. It's very, very natural because, first of all, it's how when we read a story or watch a show, it's how we experience the story. That's where we start from. That's where our mind is. And secondly, for the same reason, a lot of writers write exactly this way. They don't know necessarily exactly where they're going. They start with something that's interesting right now, and then they ask themselves, what happens next? So this is the "and then what happened" story arc, where you keep asking what happens next until you reach an ending. And that's fantastic. But in terms of structure, it doesn't give us much. When we say that we have an ending, what does it mean to have ended a compelling opening situation? What does that actually entail? What goes into that? Even more than that, we have this idea of the situation developing. But that's very unclear. The answer to what happens next can have so many different answers. So many things can be the thing that happens next, and any of them are a valid answer to what happens next. And that means that we're not getting any guidance on what shape we want the story to have. Let me explain with an example. We're going to look at the story of Mulan, which, if you're not familiar with the ancient Chinese ballad, you may be familiar with the more recent Disney adaptation. Mulan opens with a fantastic opening situation. Mulan's father is being recruited to join the army. He will die if he goes and he fights, and so she sneaks out, she takes his place, she pretends to be a man in order to take her father's place in the war. So this is our opening situation. Mulan pretending to be a man in the army in order to save her father. There is so much here. What happens next? Well, there are a lot of options. You could look at so many different things to be, okay, is what happens next something in the war? Is it something with her family? Is it something with her pretending to be a man? You have lots of options of what might happen next. And also, when you get to an ending, what is the correct ending implied by the beginning of her pretending to be a man in order to save her father? We have lots of different possible elements that may or may not be part of the ending. For example, maybe the story ends with Mulan proving herself among the men. The ending could be that she gets to be a woman again. She gets to go back to her old life and be who she used to be before all this started. The ending might be the shattering of the stereotypes that make this whole situation so tense and difficult to begin with. Or, there is a war going on, and so winning the war might be the ending of the story. Any of these would make sense. And since there have been many iterations and adaptations of Mulan, you won't be surprised to hear that different versions of Mulan have different elements of these as their ending, as their finale. It's easy to see that each one of these endings, if we want those to be the satisfying conclusion, then each one of them needs a kind of a different build-up for that ending to be satisfying. For example, if we say that the ending needs to be that she's able to prove herself among the men, then in order for that to be a good ending, the body of the story should be about a sense of self-doubt and humiliation. Is she good enough? Can she prove herself? That needs to be the lead-in to that ending. On the other hand, if it's that she gets to be a woman again, we need a very, very different buildup. We need to see that she misses her old life and wants to get back to it. And in a similar way, each of the other endings would require a different sense of buildup. So here's what I'm getting at. The arc that asks all the time, what happens next, doesn't give us this kind of guidance. It doesn't tell us what the story needs. It's improvising, and that's great, but it doesn't have this sense of structure of how each part affects the others. Anything that can happen qualifies. It's only when we tether ourselves to answering the question, what is the specific thing that we care about, that we get actual directions for what the story should have, what expectations we have from it, how it needs to be constructed. So once we have that idea of a single story arc, of this one-dimensional story arc representing the one thing that we care about inside that arc, we can start weaving those together. We can look at a story and say that it's composed of many arcs, of the many things that we care about, and they're all interwoven. And we might have some large arcs that encompass the entire story, and they follow it from start to finish. We might have smaller arcs, things that start and are resolved, things that come up later in the story and are solved then. We might even be able to do weird stuff like, an arc that starts and then is completely forgotten about and then it comes back at the end. This gives us a first initial direction for how we can talk about structure in a very helpful but also flexible way as a bunch of arcs, each representing the one thing that we care about in that arc, that are all intertwined and interplaying with each other. A really helpful example here is the Lord of the Rings movies, particularly their ending, because among their many other qualities, the Lord of the Rings movies are somewhat infamous for having more than 16 minutes of ending scene, and you feel like the movie's over, and then wait, nope, there's another ending scene and another ending scene after that. There's the ending at Mount Doom, and then there's the ending back with the Fellowship, and then there's the ending crowning Aragorn, and then there's the ending where they come back to the Shire, and where they leave the Shire, and where they stay in the Shire. And why are there all of these endings? Well, because there are all of these arcs. The arcs answer that. All of these endings are necessary because each one of them closes off a different story arc. Any one of them, if it had been left dangling, you would have felt like something was missing. And I'm not saying this is a very good or elegant way of handling a whole lot of story arcs, but what it does do is it lets you see the different story arcs, how each one of these scenes closes off a different thing that you care about one by one. So let's go back to the Discworld stories. I'm going to make the argument that the different subseries don't just have their own characters, they have their own arcs. Each series has its own repeating story shape. And by looking at what we care about, how we engage with it, and how it concludes, in each one of those subseries, we're going to be able to see those different shapes, those arcs. We're going to be able to see them very, very clearly. We're going to use that as a jumping board to the idea of distinct kinds of arcs. And we can give a few broad categories of what we might care about. And we're going to see that knowing which category a story is aiming for will tell us a lot about how we expect that story to be built. What kinds of arcs do the different Discworld series have, and what kind of arcs are there? That's what we're going to be discussing in the next video, using a fantastically useful approach called mice. You can find more of my work at zeevoodies.com. On Twitter, I'm quite vague. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in part 2.